Good morning, everybody. Welcome to First Church, First Center here in New York. We have an in-house audience. Welcome to everyone. And all of you on the Zoom call, I was taking a look at the names as I was in the back of the room. So welcome. Today I have a lesson that I put together from a couple different articles. I think I'm going to disclose one of my favorite sources today, in case you are interested in picking up any one of his books. There was a columnist who was very popular in the 90s. His name is William Edelin, and he wrote, I think, 4 books, at least that I have, one of which is entitled Spirit. Mr. Edelin was a columnist. Hundreds of papers picked him up. He's really quite an amazing author, and one of my favorite teachers in Florida, Dr. Bill, used Bill Edelin as the source of many of his best talks because he questions things in a way that you don't usually hear in most churches. As I look at the book Spirit, just to give you an indication, he talks about our founders, and Christianity, and Thomas Jefferson and his thoughts, and the various Bibles that the presidents had, and he has thoughts from Abraham Lincoln, and he gets into chapters on humanism, being proud to be a humanist, and then he takes on the traditional churches and asks questions of what do we mean by God, and then delves into the worship of the Bible and the history, and it really gets into the orthodoxy and all of the dogma that was passed on to all of us coming out of the Judeo-Christian system. Then he gets into religious issues, and he gets into thoughts about mysticism, defining mysticism. Another article on there's no dualism in mysticism, which is something we teach every week, that there's one power, one presence, and many other things. So that's a source that I use many times if you're wondering where some of this stuff comes from. And of course, much of it also comes from Ernest Holmes and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and God knows everybody else that I use at this point in my life. I wanted to read a few sentences from this book because it ties into today's lesson. Today's lesson is entitled, Our Unbelief Can Lead Us Home. It's that part of us that will question all the dogma and all the stuff that that was passed on to us when we were younger. Our unbelief can lead us back to authentic experience. So let me start with a few sentences from Mr. Edelin's book, Spirit, where he says, trust your own experience. And I'm just going to skim through some of it for you. He was invited to speak at a Unitarian fellowship, and the subject he spoke about is how to develop your own personal theology and religious philosophy free from authoritarian direction. I can't seem to get that word today. First, begin by taking a hard critical look at all so-called religious authorities. Take a look at all of it. And I come from, the Roman Catholic, and take a look at all of that. But everybody comes from somewhere. So, in how to develop your own personal theology and religious philosophy, free from all of, all the dogma, begin by taking a hard critical look at all the so-called authorities. Second, learn to trust your very own personal experience. And see, that's exactly what Ernest Holmes was teaching. Learn to trust your very own personal experience and intuition. There's a quote from Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson said, your own reason is the only oracle given to you by God. So whatever it is inside of you. according to Jefferson and according to our author. Number 3, accept the risks that go along with taking control of your own life, your own thinking, and your own direction. Number 4, enjoy the joys and the freedom that go with such a new orientation. Can you imagine what it would have been like if you were raised without any of the dogma that might have come from the religions of our ancestors? And yet, he goes on to say, how many still yearn for outside religious authority to pat us on the head and tell us we've been good, or slap us our little hands and tell us we've been bad, ensuring that we stay forever emotionally stunted and dwarfed spiritually? Buckminster Fuller, which some of you may know of, who was the most brilliant person alive, they thought, in these circles, had observations. He says it all. He said, this was from Buckminster Fuller, he said, all organized religions of the past were developed as beliefs in secondhand information. Then he went on to say, it will be an entirely new era when we find, they use him, I'll say, when mankind or humankind finds ourselves confronted with direct experience. So this is what our teaching offers. This is what our classes offer always, is the invitation for you to wake up to the realization that you have it. You have it within. You have access to it. So I wanted to start out with a little, that's the prequel to the lesson. There's a little poem that Emerson wrote in, I think it was his spiritual essays. And he said, there is no great and there is no small to the soul that maketh all. And where it comes, all things are, and it comes from everywhere. I, that's you, are the owner of the sphere. You are the owner of the 7 stars in the solar year, of Caesar's hand and Plato's brain, of Lord Christ's heart and Shakespeare's strain. You probably have to think about that poem a little bit, but he's suggesting there that you have dominion and access to everything that is, everything that was, and you're a part of everything that will be. And you were an inlet and outlet. You were infinitely connected with the mind of God. He went on to say, there is one mind common to all individuals. One mind. We think it's all about us and our thinking, but there's a deeper part of you. I taught a class in this not too long ago that's connected to everything that is. Every one of us is an inlet to this energy, and we're an inlet in equal measure. There's no great or small. Remember, in the God that created all, we're all a part of it. Each of us have the ability to choose, the ability to reason and think. Now, if you abdicate your thinking and your reasoning to dogma and churches and institutions, that's just what you do. But each of you do have the ability to wake up and to choose what to think, to choose your own thoughts, and to express yourself. You were meant to come here to learn and to express. Each of us has the ability to choose, to reason, to think. What Plato thought, or what we may think, what a wise person has thought or felt, we have the capacity to understand all of this and what has happened before, because we are we can't be separated from this universal mind, the mind that's one with all that is. For this is the only and sovereign agent, Emerson said. It moves forward, life moves forward by means of its creation, and that means it moves forward by you, and it moves forward by me and all of us. It does so without hurry, without rest. The human spirit goes forward from the beginning to embody every thought, every emotion, always in appropriate time and space. But the thought, Emerson wrote, is always prior to the fact. Of the universal source, each individual person is one more incarnation. You are more than what came before you, and you're a part of what came before you, and you're a part of what will happen. Every attribute is in us. All its attributes are in us. Each new thing, each new fact in our private experience, it ignites something. It flashes a light on what great numbers have done before. We are connected with all of the souls that have lived. Every evolutionary change was first thought in a single person's mind, and then usually, if it's a new idea, other people very quickly start thinking these great things happen. It seems like great minds discover it all at once because we're all connected with one another. Every evolutionary change, again, was first thought in one person's mind, a heretic of some kind. So we're introducing that word in today's lesson. We're learning that heretics aren't so bad. So it starts with a heretic of some kind, a free thinker. And when the same thought occurs to another, which is the way it usually works very quickly, this becomes a key to that era. And it's a time where change starts. Great and new ideas seem to come forward at the right time when, the world is ready for them. Every great change or leap was once, it started with a private opinion, right? I want to talk a little bit today about having the courage to think for yourself. Because you are an individual and you can. Now, some of you don't. Some of you spend a lot of effort trying to be liked and trying to fit in. I've been there before, probably still do it. But in our teaching, we're suggesting that, there's greatness within you, and there's something within you that is trying to express itself. And maybe you've suppressed it, maybe you haven't had time, maybe you've been too busy, but there's an invitation in this teaching always to wake up to greatness and to truth. And you can allow guidance in, because there is that which within you that's trying to guide you. You can allow guidance and you can think a new thought. All of the facts of history pre-exist in the mind as laws. So everything that came before was an inspiration, it was a thought, and it comes to manifestation through laws. These are thoughts that demonstrated at the perfect time and in the perfect way. The history of our source is observable everywhere. This would be a thought from Emerson. We are all connected to everyone that has come before us. We say that with reverence, we say that with awareness, and we say that with thanksgiving. Many people who've been involved in our lives that have brought us to the point where we are, they've passed on to us the best that they could with what they had. And today we're awake. If you're in this teaching, you begin to understand that there's a law of attraction, and you begin to understand that life is responding to you. It's responding to us. Sometimes it is our unbelief or our disbelief that will lead the way towards truth, or it will lead the way to God, or will lead the way home. Regardless of what your old ideas have been, what you've done up until now in the world, or your jobs, your vocations, or what your family has believed for generations, the point of power, as you hear me say most weeks, is in the present. It's in the now, in the present moment. Barker famously said yesterday, ended last night. And you're able, if you want to create a new reality at any time. I looked up the word heretic because I was wanting to make sure I knew exactly what the definition was. And it's defined as someone who has an opinion that's opposite or against the official or popular opinion. How many times have you been there? Someone who has a different opinion than what, the people you hang out with think. Someone who believes contrary to the fundamental tenets of a religion they claim to belong to. Well, I remember belonging to a religion when I was a kid, and boy, I didn't fit into that religion very well. And I would go to church every morning before school, and I would pray, and I would see all kinds of images, and there would be all kinds of There were angels, there were saints, there were people to pray to. There was a lot going on. And there were a lot of things that would suggest, that I am and people are sinners, and there was original sin, there were mortal sins, there was all kinds of things in that particular religion. I was becoming a person who was believing contrary to the fundamental tenets of a religion that I belonged to. And as I thought about the word heretic a bit, I can see where it would apply to me and many who are now on this call in New Thought. It's very easy. I'm reading, this comes from Edelin's article. It's very easy to tell if you're a heretic. How can you tell? Well, we often wear a social mask or many masks. We don't show our hands, so to speak. Can you imagine a friend or acquaintance or colleague asking you a question and the answer won't be what they want to hear, so you just don't tell them, right? They might say something like, do you mean to say you're not a blankety blank anymore? So, you can fill in the blank. It could be a Christian or a Jewish person, or it could be, whatever it is. It could be a political thing. It could be anything. Or they might say, do you mean to say you support this or you support that idea? And so people ask questions like that. And I remember when I was younger, when I was starting to head into New Thought circles, people would say, how can you say you are a blank? You fill in the blank. How can you say you are this? And there's likely all kinds of things you might not believe in. And so I was a bit of a heretic. I was becoming one. There were a lot of things I was starting to believe in that I wasn't supposed to believe on many subjects. So now we're in the 2020s, and a lot of us have learned to keep our opinions to ourselves. With the media, the world seems to be divided, and I say seems to be divided because I know that's not really the truth. People want to be liked, they want to be approved of, so we don't always let them know what we think. So, we do wear masks, many of us. The question I had as I was putting the lesson together and reading Edelin's wonderful article is, when did everyone's opinions become so very important? When did everyone else's opinions become so important that mine just wasn't spoken anymore? Are you able to express yourself freely? We're here to express and to love and extend love and to express life freely. And then we look at social media. The whole thing is about getting people to like and comment and all of that. And there's almost like an addiction to having people like and comment what you do and what you say. And there's a sense of well-being that comes from, I've read about it, it's like an addiction. If you're not trending, if you're not getting the right responses, if they're not liking you, people get all upset. And I do a lot of lessons on the idea of being other-referred, and that ties into codependency. And we go back to Terry Cole Whitaker's great book, which was What You Think of Me Is None of My Business. Why is it so important what other people think of us? The article goes on to say a Taoist cares nothing about what you believe. They're perfectly content with you believing whatever you want to believe. I'd like to be in that place, right? Wouldn't you? We're not living after the world's opinion, hopefully, as you get into metaphysics. A Taoist cares nothing about what you believe, nothing about what you believe about Jesus, or Hindu or a Jew. What heresy is for one person won't slightly matter to another. It'll be considered totally irrelevant. And with another person, it'll be a great stand for freedom of thought. Some people won't care that you believe differently. They think, well, it's great that you have the ability to express yourself. All values are relative to the person and to the mind that entertains them. There was a federal judge, his name was Learned Hand, and he praised heresy with these words. He said, "The organization or society that has smothered the heretic has always suffered. It's always declined." The judge says it's important to have the differing points of view, because that's oftentimes the way life moves forward. So again, I was looking up heresy once again. The word originally had a very positive meaning. It comes from a Greek verb meaning to choose. It means a personal choice. But when there's no freedom, there can be no choice, because choices are not always welcome. Our teaching, the science of mind, encourages us to be authentic. It encourages us to find our voice. It encourages us to realize that we have something within us that's always wooing us, trying to get our attention, so we can express authentically. Sometimes people who think and speak freely are somehow threatening to people. It could be in religions, or it could be in your group, it could be in your little social circle. They don't want you to be outside of their circle, or outside of, but you were made to be a free agent, someone who can express your thoughts, your heart, your emotions, your feelings. Heresy is in reality nothing more than making a choice that's different than the accepted belief of whatever group it is that you're talking about. Now, I recall my personal experience when I was younger, and I was just coming out of a very, very dogmatic church. And in those days, it was heavy duty. I think they've kind of like tamed it all down since, but at the time, I remember coming out of it. And I wound up going to a Unity church, and people, friends of mine, would challenge me about going to Unity. Again, with the questions. What do I believe about this? And what do I believe about that? And you can imagine the kind of questions I would get. Did I believe in the salvation of my soul? Did I believe in the resurrection? Did I believe in this? And then it would go on and on and on. And I could get into all of that, and I won't. Because there's no point. It was clear that the people, my old friends, weren't really trying to understand what I was learning. They're really coming in trying to tell me I was wrong. And that was not a good time for me to be told I was wrong, because I was just developing enough courage to find my way. I wasn't trying to pull them away from what they were believing or convert them to anything. I was just simply trying to find my own way. If you're very new to New Thought, these ideas, like I'm one with the one, I'm supported, I'm loved, I'm important, I'm 1 in a billion, life loves me, life responds to me, I release the need to think of myself as a sinner. And when you get into a teaching like this, it might be good to take some time with yourself with this, because if you start, I've seen it happen, people find these classes and then they start sharing it with their friends, and they haven't yet embraced it enough, and all of a sudden there's this onslaught of stuff that starts coming at you, because you're not going to find everybody receptive to it, I promise you. Many people are going to stay right where they are. This is what people usually do. At least now, as many years later, I know how to sidestep certain kinds of questions that are coming at me. I can almost tell when they're coming whether they really want to know something, or if they're trying to challenge you and basically say you're wrong and they're right. I can discern when somebody wants to have a real inquiry and it really is looking for guidance or help too. I was starting to have the courage to think for myself more and more and find my way, find my friends, find like-minded people, teachers, and all of that. I didn't know how in those days to sidestep those kind of inbound questions. I recall very well-intentioned people who were telling me I was involved in a cult when I started attending Unity. And again, at the time, I didn't know enough to sidestep those questions or conversations. They must have thought I was a real heretic, I'm sure. And I'd let myself get in a corner from time to time and try to explain myself, and it all would go south. It rarely worked out. I realized most people don't really want to change. You got to remember, you've got a lifetime of beliefs supported by churches of every kind and families. So people don't want to change. That's fine. I'm glad that I, either felt the heat or saw the light, and that I wanted to change and I wasn't trying to change anyone else. If you're on a broadcast like this, you're trying to learn how to appreciate life. You're trying to learn how to use the power that you have, that Ernest Holmes spoke of. Remember, there's power for good in the universe, and it's in you, and you can use it. And again, I started off at Unity, attending Unity, and they wanted to know, some of these people in my life, friends, if you want to call them friends, how I thought about Jesus and what I thought. And this wasn't the Unity people, but these were people that I used to associate with. And I was living in a small New England town, and seemed everybody that I was friends with grew up in the same faith I was, because we all went to the Catholic school. There were 2 Catholic schools, and so I was definitely a heretic, and I was moving out and on. Of course, that was many years ago, and it took a lot for me to step away from all of that, from my youth, because it was taught to me both in school, it was taught to me in church, it was taught to me by my parents and my grandparents, and I'm sure it was taught to them by their grandparents. So there's a lot of things that came along with that faith, which included guilt and shame and the idea that I was born in sin, and so is everybody else. And then I needed to seek out forgiveness for my very life and my sins, and I needed to be purified because I was born with sin and all of that. I don't know that I was particularly brave, but I knew that somehow or another I could not accept all of that. I had a sense that there was a God, whatever that was, and I had a sense that God was good. That much I knew from the time I was 6 years old. Beyond that, everything was problematic. There was no personal happiness. There was a lot of talk about sacrificing and offering my life up. And then there was sin and more sin. And I was taught that I was to keep praying for forgiveness. I talk to people now, and they don't teach half of that anymore, because basically everybody's left those churches and those faiths worldwide, but that's what the dogma was. It caused a lot of problems for a lot of people in a lot of places. I remember studying at Unity, and afterwards that 5 centuries into the Christian faith, they decided women were human. They had something like 12 or 14 Gospels. Eventually 4 made the final edition. Nobody I ever knew had a problem with what Jesus taught, but what was brought into the whole mix with the churches and the faiths and all of that really did a number on a lot of people. So today's lesson is your unbelief can lead you home to truth. So that's what we're talking about. And it did for me. I began attending a few Unity services here and there, and I heard that they took all of the fire and brimstone out of the Sunday service, and that there was no emphasis on sin and salvation. In fact, they talked about sin as self-imposed nonsense, which they got from Alan Cohen. They called it Unity School of Christianity, but of course it wasn't teaching the same kind of Christianity that I was just referring to. It wasn't what was taught to me by the Catholics or the Protestants. With Unity, there was more emphasis on the parables, the stories taught by Jesus. Ideas like the kingdom of God is at hand. It's here. It's now. And that Jesus said these things and greater. He said, these things and greater you can do too. And that's what we teach in Science of Mind as well. I remember them saying at Unity all those years ago that he lived as an example of what we can be. So Unity worked for a long time for me, though I distinctly remember people telling me I was in a cult, plain and simple. I heard it everywhere. But it felt like home for quite a while, because I was able to reinterpret many of the best teachings of Jesus without any of the dogma. That I didn't have any of the dogma that, I had when I was in the fundamental faiths. The places I came from, I was definitely a heretic. But, I was beginning to move forward. The parables I loved, the prodigal child was always my favorite. It still is, because it's the perfect story. It talks of all of us being born into this realm. I don't want to use the word kingdom anymore. I'll say a realm. We're born into this realm, and we're the child of the high, the king or the queen. And we can never be lost. We can only wake up to the fact that we're part of this one incredible energy in life. That's the perfect parable, certainly my favorite. Eventually, I came into religious science, a religious science center or church, where they no longer needed any of the scriptures to teach truth. They didn't need the parables either, though they often used them. Religious science can be taught using a variety of sources, just about any source. Because in religious science, we're always talking about a principle that responds to you. In religious science, we dropped the anthropomorphic God. It didn't need to be a father. It didn't need to be a man. It didn't need to be anything. It's beyond anything we could ever name. It's beyond anything we could ever describe. But we know that it is. And Ernest Holmes would talk about what it is and how it works and all of that, the first 4 chapters of the textbook. I always will love Unity for the work that they did and for the work that they do. I always thought it was the perfect thing for me. It was a bridge for people like me out of dogma into experiencing, we'll say, God directly. I don't think I could have connected with religious science head-on without Unity. It mattered. Unity mattered because I was too indoctrinated. I needed to go through the Unity experience first, and I'm really grateful it happened. Louise helped greatly too. There was a time where I was introduced to the book, You Can Heal Your Life, and it's safe to say in this broadcast, Louise and her work became very important to me also, because I started to present her material to different works, and I didn't realize it. I was starting to learn and teach the science of mind. It was in different settings, and the work was getting noticed, and people were healing. I was offered jobs to train counselors and staff in her simple but life-changing methods. I mention this today because I've learned through the Louise Hay work that consciousness can heal. Let me say it another way. Changed consciousness can heal. I saw that at work. I saw beautiful and indescribable things work with people who had AIDS. I saw healings occur with people who are dealing with cancers and broken relationships. I saw a lot. I saw improvements across the board and visible demonstrations in a wide variety of situations. I was learning about self-healing and consciousness healing and true mind-body connection and healing without even knowing science of mind at that point or Ernest Holmes. So I was learning Ernest Holmes via Louise Hay. I was having direct experience of the teaching before I even read the textbook. I knew Louise was involved with religious science, and I later learned she was a student here at New York Church, where we are right now. And when I started attending classes at a religious science center, I realized that there were many of what I affectionately will now call heretics with me. All kinds of people. There were people from the AA groups, there were people from Unity, there were people from I found my tribe at last, right? The ones that were questioning everything. Of course, some grew up in the teaching, but very few. I remember Barbara Lundy, who had both her parents were ministers. She was doubly blessed, and she had a slightly different upbringing than I did. The vast majority of the people who were in attendance were much like me. Most of us had been part of an old religion that was comprised with strict rules and dogma. Most of the people I was close to somehow had the strength to find their way to new thought. Many found their way to new thought by way of a 12-step program because they had things to heal first. Because they were in such pain and suffering, they turned to alcohol and drugs. And eventually they found their way to New Thought. It sometimes takes a lot for people to leave their faiths, the faiths of their childhood. There's a struggle with the idea of a loving God when there's been years of belief in a God of wrath that punishes and all of that. Some people, again, turn to alcohol for relief. When I discovered Science of Mind, I found people in recovery, I found people who had moved on from unity, and I found a lot of like-minded people who were in pursuit of truth and the study of truth and the study of consciousness. When I encountered Ernest Holmes, his startling statement, which was, there's a power for good in the universe greater than you, of which you are a part, and you can use it. Boy, that struck home. There were a lot of brilliant people around, and that information, those sentences and statements I had not yet heard. There were many new books for me to consider, and there was the genius of Ernest Holmes himself, Emerson, and then there was always Louise Hay, who, because of her book, You Can Heal Your Life, was bringing in more and more people into the New Thought movement. Perhaps some of you are like I was then. Perhaps you're trying to figure it out now. You're trying to figure out where you fit in, and you're trying to hang on to some of what your beliefs from childhood. The thing I can suggest is, wherever you are, if you're on the call and this is new, just stay with it. No one here is ever going to try to take anything away from you. By that I mean, there's people who still go to some of their churches, and they kind of like do a hybrid thing. If there's some comfort you get from another place, take the best of it and keep the best of it. We're not trying to convert anybody here. Never have been. We're not a religion in any traditional sense. Ernest Holmes' primary desire was for people to realize that they have this connection with Source and that it is available to them. He was a bit torn about the idea of creating churches of religious science. He preferred learning centers and institutes, because what was more important for him, or to him, was to see people learn about the idea that they can have direct experience of the divine. You can experience Source. You can have this awareness. It's right there in front of you. It's at hand, just like Jesus said. He knew the divine was not found in the heavens or in the churches. Rather, he knew that this thing is already in you. You have to be a bit of a heretic to come to that, see that, at least from the places that I grew up in. Oh goodness, the churches have built cathedrals for hundreds of years, and everything is in the heavens, they said. Everything is done. You look at these beautiful structures and the arts and the gold and the fantastic sculptures and paintings. Ernest Holmes was describing the power and the presence that's always been here and always will be here, and a power and a presence that was here before the churches and will be here long after the churches. And that presence and power has always been in every human soul that has ever lived. And it's in you, operating through you right now. And it woos and guides and inspires you if you will allow it. Years later, I read, sadly, a Jesuit. They were the educators, the Catholics, a motto. And they said, "Give me a child until he or she is 7, and I will give you the person." In other words, and I believe they were talking about having them for life. So if you have all that training, and it's been coming at you since the time you were a child, it's really tough to pull away from it. There's got to be something in you that's really strongly moving you away from it. Now, I'm getting up in years now. Maybe you were spared some of this. I certainly hope you were. Many of you, maybe you were told that you were a child of God and wonderful. I mean, wouldn't that be great if we had a generation who was raised, with the message, you were a child of God and you were wonderful. And you're great and you're going to be great. And you're 1 in a million or 1 in a billion. Maybe you didn't have to become an unbeliever or a heretic. Maybe you didn't have to reject anything or any of this type of stuff. Maybe you didn't get any of this, but this was definitely the message of the 1950s, 1960s, and I think a little bit later, to Catholics and many Christians. Again, I'm told by some friends today that it's changed a lot. I'm told the fire and brimstone that was preached in many of the other Christian groups doesn't really exist so much anymore. The idea of heaven and hell and places in between, all that stuff that was taught to generations of people, I wonder what happened to those people. I used to be frustrated with my parents because it was passed on to them and they were passing it on to me. But people generally accept the faith they're born into if they have one. And that's that, unless there's something about it that's holding them back. I can think of many people, myself included, who are faced with having to decide to accept this stuff or at some point reject it. Again, it can be very difficult, and it's like, I was a young kid, a young guy. Who am I to question or reject all of this wisdom of all these ages? I mean, I didn't know what end was up at that point in my life, really. But I knew that I wasn't fitting into that. And as I said, it was tough in the beginning. I was being scrutinized, I was being condemned, cornered, and questioned. And I wasn't prepared for all of that. The idea that I was in a cult and all of that. People would ask me whether I knew that there was a savior for my sins, and all that stuff's a lot of questions that, it's tough to answer. But ultimately, I had the courage to walk away, but not without a lot of pain and some ego strength. And it was a system that wants you to stay in the system and not to question, not to be a heretic. So eventually things began to turn around. My time at Unity and then Science of Mind, those early years, really was spent deprogramming all of the things that I just described to you. Your Erroneous Zones, I think it was my first self-help book by Wayne Dyer, helped me with my erroneous thinking, and that was really the things that were really holding me back. And I believe we need to keep that stuff in check, because I think a lot of those beliefs from those old faiths in our childhood have a way of creeping back in. So I can definitely relate to the article by Mr. Edelin and the idea of being a heretic and a rebel. William Edelin wrote the column long ago entitled, "Heretics Often Light a Way Toward Truth and to God." I think it's true because it's the person who has the unbelief or who has the doubt in the dogma who speaks up. That person will question the rules, the restrictions, and all the different dressings because they want to get the essence of the thing. I've never really met a person that had anything negative to say about Jesus, I will say to you today, or what he taught. If they took time, and especially if they took time to figure out what he was actually saying. The problem is with all the hundreds of particular branches of that faith is that they've added so many rules, restrictions, dogma of every kind that it distorts his simple and beautiful message. It is these that pit one believer against another and one religion against another. He was very clear from what I can tell about his themes were always lessons on love and forgiveness, loving your brother, your sister as yourself, forgiving endlessly, loving your enemies, and much more. He was not a fault finder. He too was a rebel. He questioned the very religious authorities. We all know the story. Jesus was a great heretic. The people cried heresy after he spoke and he talked. Christianity, of course, was heresy to Judaism. Then again, Buddha and Buddhism was heresy to Hinduism. Christianity was bursting with heresy in its youthful expansion. We've had a holiday recently, Thanksgiving, and we spoke about the early pilgrims in the settlement of Plymouth, Massachusetts. The pilgrims themselves were heretics. Let's think of the heretics of civilization who have each in some way with their questioning contributed to our growth and our enlightenment. Heretics, think of them. People who question conventional wisdom. People like Freud, people like Einstein and Darwin. And we could add dozens and dozens more. The church elders believed back in those days that the sun moved around the earth. Do you all remember that? For centuries. They believed that the sun moved around the earth. Do you remember that, or do you remember reading about it? Yes, the elders in the churches believed that the sun moved around the earth, and the earth was the center of the universe. Let us thank the universe today for the heretics. People like Copernicus and Galileo, who revealed the truth to the church and the world that it was just the opposite, that the earth moved around the sun. More than that, the heretics showed us that we are not the center of the universe, and we're not even a major part of our own galaxy. We teach here that God is within. God is the truth. Jesus taught the same. God is love. It is presence. It's an activity. That it is an aliveness permeating all things, now and always. Before we wrap up today's lessons, let us know, far more often than not, it has been the heretics who have pointed us toward the truth, toward God, toward the mystery in their questioning. While the authoritative, the dogmatic, unchanging institutions tremble, defending the old and archaic cosmologies, religions and structures, goddesses, angels, and all the rest, which were borrowed from mythology of older religions. The great Emerson spoke about the thinker who thinks, the thinker who is let loose, someone who is thinking independently, who's living and communing with life. He said, beware when the great God lets loose a thinker on this earth, then all things are at risk. It's as when a conflagration is broken out into a great city and no one knows what's safe or where it will end. There's a continuing need always for us to wake up and be our authentic selves and try to figure out who we've come here to be and what our contribution is. And let Spirit speak directly to us and guide us. There's a need for these types of people who have the freedom to think and choose and follow their inner guidance wherever it takes them. And so it is. Thank you.